It was a bright and lively afternoon in the middle of a large, crowded square. People were chatting, laughing, and enjoying the atmosphere. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm glow on the scene below. The air was full of the hum of excited voices as everyone gathered to witness the important public event. There were families, tourists, and even some local dignitaries in attendance. The event was supposed to be a grand celebration, and the square was buzzing with energy. Among the crowd stood a group of highly disciplined guards, dressed in perfectly neat uniforms. They were standing still in their usual, unflinching posture, each one keeping watch, looking straight ahead as they had been trained to do. Their focus was unshakable, and they didn't show any sign of distraction, no matter what happened around them. Their job was to maintain order and be present for the important occasion. It was a job that demanded patience, discipline, and a great deal of self-control. As the ceremony continued, everything seemed to go according to plan. But in the midst of this orderly event, there was one young man in the crowd who stood out. His appearance was casual, and his energy seemed different from the rest. He wasn't there for the ceremony. He seemed more interested in the excitement around him. His eyes scanned the guards, observing them with a mix of curiosity and amusement. There was something about the way they stood so rigidly, so perfectly still, that caught his attention. In a split second, the young man's curiosity led him to act. Without thinking too much, he casually approached one of the guards who was standing in a line, his back straight and his gaze focused. With a quick movement, the young man reached out and grabbed the strap on the guard's uniform. The guard, caught by surprise, flinched for just a second. But that was enough for the young man to feel the tension in the air. The crowd, for a moment, seemed to freeze. People turned their heads, sensing that something unusual had just happened. The guard's expression didn't change. His face remained composed, almost as if nothing had occurred. He quickly adjusted his posture, not allowing the tug on his strap to throw him off balance. It was a surprising moment. Most people would expect the guard to react immediately, perhaps to scold the young man or give him a sharp warning. But instead, the guard remained silent, not moving a muscle, not showing any sign of being upset or even flustered. His professionalism was evident, and his calmness sent a strange but reassuring message to the crowd. This is not a big deal. The young man, now realizing that the moment was not as dramatic as he had expected, looked around to gauge the reactions of others. He was unsure whether the incident was something to be laughed at or something he should apologize for. The crowd, too, seemed unsure of what to do. Some people chuckled awkwardly, while others stared in silence. No one knew how the situation would unfold next. Would the guard respond harshly? Would the young man be escorted away? Or would something else entirely happen? In that brief, almost surreal moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. The tension in the air was palpable. It was as if everyone was waiting for a signal, waiting to see how the situation would resolve. It was only the beginning of what would turn out to be a surprising and memorable event for everyone involved. As the seconds ticked by, the young man stood there, staring at the guard, unsure of what to do next. His hand had only pulled lightly on the strap of the guard's uniform, but the effect was more dramatic than he had expected. It was a bold move, one that he hadn't really thought through. His heart raced, and for a moment, it seemed like time had slowed down. Around him, the crowd was shifting and murmuring, as if they were waiting for something to happen. But what would happen next? No one could quite tell. The guard, meanwhile, stood perfectly still, as if nothing had happened. His face remained expressionless, his posture never faltering. It was clear that he was trained for moments like this, prepared for anything that might come his way. The young man looked closely at him, trying to read the guard's face for some sign of what he was thinking. Was he angry, annoyed, or was he just waiting for the situation to pass? The young man couldn't tell, and that left him feeling even more unsure. A few people in the crowd chuckled nervously, but the guard remained unmoved. The laughter only lasted for a second before it faded, as if everyone realized that the moment was becoming more serious than they had anticipated. The tension in the air grew thicker, and the young man could feel the weight of all those eyes on him. It felt as though the entire square was holding its breath, waiting for the next action to unfold. For a moment, the young man thought about stepping away, just walking off and pretending nothing had happened. But something held him in place. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the strange sense of responsibility that came with being the center of attention. Whatever it was, he didn't move. Instead, he glanced around at the other guards, each standing perfectly still in their own spot, watching as the situation unfolded with a quiet professionalism. Then something unexpected happened. Out of the corner of his eye, the young man saw a senior officer approaching quickly. He was wearing a similar uniform, but had a higher rank, and there was an air of authority about him. The officer's eyes locked onto the young man, and for a brief second, it seemed like he was about to speak or even step forward to handle the situation. The young man's heart skipped a beat. Was he in trouble? The crowd seemed to sense the officer's arrival and grew even quieter. It was as if everyone was bracing for what would happen next. Would the officer scold the young man for pulling on the strap? Would he reprimand him in front of everyone? It seemed like the situation might escalate into something awkward or uncomfortable. The young man's palms grew sweaty, and he took a small step back, preparing for whatever was to come. But then something happened that no one was expecting. Instead of raising his voice or making an example of the young man, the officer did something completely different. He took a deep breath, looked at the young man with a slight smile, and spoke in a calm, even tone. His words weren't harsh or angry. In fact, they almost seemed to have a sense of understanding. "Well," the officer said, "you're not the first person to be curious about the guards." The young man blinked in surprise. This was not the response he had been expecting. The crowd, too, seemed taken aback by the officer's gentle response. The tension in the air seemed to lift a little. The officer's calm demeanor was like a breath of fresh air, breaking the silence and easing the nerves of everyone around. In that moment, the young man realized that what seemed like a serious situation was, in fact, a simple misunderstanding. The officer's words made it clear that the event was not as dramatic as it had seemed. It was almost as though the officer had seen such things happen before, and in his wisdom, he knew that there was no need for anger or punishment. The young man felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The crowd began to relax as well, and the tension slowly faded into the background. What had started as an awkward moment of uncertainty had now become something lighter, almost humorous. The young man's heart rate began to slow as he realized that nothing bad was going to happen. Instead, the situation was turning into something much more surprising and less serious than he had originally feared. As the officer spoke calmly, the young man stood there, still unsure of what to do next. He had expected a reprimand or perhaps even to be escorted away from the event. But instead, the officer's words felt like a soft breeze that eased the tension in the air. The young man glanced around, still processing the situation, but he noticed something remarkable. The mood of the crowd had changed. At first, the people had been unsure of how to react, sensing that something was off. But now, there was a shift in the atmosphere. It was as though the officer's relaxed response had given everyone permission to relax as well. The nervous laughter from earlier had died down, and people were now smiling more genuinely, as if they were realizing that this wasn't as serious as it had seemed. For the young man, the moment felt like a strange mix of relief and embarrassment. He hadn't meant to cause a scene, but his playful curiosity had certainly brought one to life. As the officer's eyes met his, the young man couldn't help but feel a little foolish for thinking that the situation might escalate. But as the officer continued to speak with a friendly tone, the young man began to relax. It seemed that this wasn't going to be a moment of punishment, but a learning experience instead. The officer then turned to the guard who had been tugged on, giving him a quick nod. The guard, still standing as still as ever, didn't show any signs of discomfort or annoyance. It was clear that he had experienced far stranger things during his time on duty. He gave the young man a brief glance, but there was no anger in his eyes, only the calm, almost patient demeanor of someone who had dealt with much worse. As the young man took a step back, a thought crossed his mind. Why had he done it in the first place? Why had he felt the urge to pull the strap of the guard's uniform? Was it just a playful moment, or was there something deeper at play? He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he felt a bit of curiosity about the guards and their unwavering stillness. They seemed so detached from the world around them, almost like statues. It made him wonder how they could stand so still for hours without breaking a sweat or getting distracted by the things happening around them. Meanwhile, the crowd continued to observe, but no one was judging the young man anymore. Instead, people were whispering among themselves, commenting on how unexpected the officer's response had been. The officer's calmness had disarmed the situation in a way no one had anticipated. Some people even smiled at the young man, as if to say, "It's okay. You didn't mean any harm." It was almost as though the whole scene had become a lesson in how to handle surprising moments with grace and understanding. The young man began to feel more at ease as the seconds passed. He realized that he hadn't ruined the day for anyone, nor had he embarrassed himself beyond repair. In fact, he was starting to feel like he was part of a much bigger moment, a small yet significant interaction that had caught the attention of everyone around him. There was something oddly satisfying in knowing that what could have been an uncomfortable encounter had turned into something everyone would remember. Still, the young man remained a little unsure of how to leave the situation behind. Should he apologize for his actions? Should he say something more to the guard or the officer? He was caught between wanting to make things right and knowing that sometimes, in moments like these, no words were necessary. Perhaps the best thing to do was simply to step back and let the moment dissolve naturally. But just as he was about to turn and walk away, he noticed something unexpected. The officer gave him a small, reassuring smile, as if to silently tell him that everything was fine. It was as though the officer had not only forgiven him, but had also accepted the moment for what it was, an innocent mistake that didn't need any further explanation. The young man took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the tension finally lift from his shoulders. He realized that in this world of rules and expectations, sometimes a small act of kindness and understanding could turn an awkward situation into something much lighter and more memorable. And with that, the young man quietly stepped away, feeling a sense of calm that he hadn't expected to find. Just when it seemed like the tension had completely dissolved, something even more unexpected happened. The young man, still trying to shake off the embarrassment, found himself caught off guard by what the officer did next. Instead of simply walking away or continuing his duties as if the situation was over, the officer turned back to the crowd with a small, almost playful smile. "You know," the officer said, raising his voice just enough for everyone to hear, "you'd be surprised how often things like this happen. People are curious, and sometimes they just don't know how to express it. It's not a big deal." The young man blinked, unsure of whether he was hearing the officer correctly. Was the officer really making light of the situation? The crowd, which had been quiet and tense moments before, seemed to soften as well. People were no longer looking at the young man with judgment in their eyes. Instead, they began to relax, and some even started to laugh a little. It was clear that the officer's calm, understanding approach was working. The whole atmosphere lightened, and what had been an uncomfortable moment moments earlier had transformed into something almost humorous. It was as if the officer had turned the whole situation into a teaching moment, not just for the young man, but for everyone who was watching. The young man realized that sometimes moments of tension don't have to escalate into something more serious. Sometimes all it takes is a shift in attitude, a little bit of humor and understanding, to turn things around. The officer wasn't angry. He wasn't going to make a big deal out of something small. Instead, he was showing everyone that sometimes the best way to handle a surprise is with a calm and lighthearted response. The crowd, still chuckling, seemed to feel the same relief. People exchanged glances, and some nodded in appreciation of how the situation had been handled. It wasn't just the young man who had learned something in that moment. Everyone around him was seeing that the world didn't always have to be so serious. Even in a public setting, with people on duty and others simply passing by, a little understanding could go a long way. The young man stood there for a moment, absorbing what had just happened. He'd never expected something so simple to teach him so much. He had thought his small action might lead to a confrontation, maybe even some kind of punishment. But instead, he was learning that sometimes it's okay to make mistakes, especially when you have the right people around you to guide you through them. The officer's response was not only kind, but it had been wise. It had turned what could have been an uncomfortable moment into a shared experience, a story everyone would remember for years to come. As the officer finished his lighthearted explanation, he turned back to the young man. "Don't worry about it. We all have those moments," the officer said, as if offering a small bit of reassurance. "Just remember, guards are pretty used to being curious about. But we have a job to do." The young man nodded, feeling the last bit of tension slip away. He realized that he had been caught up in his own thoughts, worried about what might happen, when in fact, nothing had happened that was worth stressing over. The officer's understanding had calmed the storm in his mind, and he began to feel more confident in himself. As the crowd slowly started to disperse, people began to chat amongst themselves about the unexpected turn of events. Some of them seemed impressed by how the officer had handled the situation, while others were simply relieved that nothing more serious had come from it. The young man couldn't help but smile a little, knowing that he had been a part of something unique, something that had gone from a moment of awkwardness to one of shared understanding. The incident, which seemed like such a small and nervous moment just moments before, was now something much more. It had spread through the crowd like wildfire. People who had witnessed the exchange between the young man and the officer were beginning to talk among themselves, sharing their perspectives on what had happened. It wasn't long before the event was buzzing with whispers and comments, as others who had missed the moment asked what had occurred. The young man, still processing the kindness and calm of the officer, found himself approached by a few people who had witnessed the exchange. They smiled warmly at him, as if letting him know that everything was all right, and no one thought less of him for his moment of curiosity. He was surprised by how easy it was to talk to the people around him now. Instead of being treated like someone who had caused a problem, he was starting to feel like part of a larger, shared experience. The crowd's reaction made him realize that everyone understood how moments like this could happen to anyone. Not long after, one of the news reporters covering the event approached the officer for a brief interview, asking about the situation. The officer, still calm and composed, smiled when the reporter asked about how he had handled things so gracefully. He explained that it wasn't the first time something like this had happened during his time on duty. In fact, he mentioned how often people were curious about the guards and sometimes needed to satisfy their curiosity in strange ways. The reporter asked if there were ever any serious incidents during these moments, but the officer laughed softly. "Not really. Most people are just looking for something to entertain themselves, and sometimes they forget that we are still people too. I've had everything from children asking questions to tourists trying to take sneaky pictures. It's all part of the job." The officer's perspective was refreshing to hear. It showed a side of the job that most people didn't consider, the fact that being the guard wasn't just about standing still. It was about interacting with the world around them in a way that kept order, while also showing patience and understanding. The officer's tone was light, but there was a subtle wisdom in his words. He wasn't angry or frustrated by the constant attention. He had simply learned to accept it and respond to it in a way that kept things peaceful. Later that day, the young man heard from some of the other witnesses about how the story had spread. Some had shared their own funny experiences of interacting with the guards in the past, and others had simply mentioned how impressed they were by how the situation had been handled. Some of them had even taken the opportunity to reflect on how easily things could have gone differently if the officer had reacted in anger or frustration. Instead, the officer had chosen to respond with understanding and humor. turning what could have been a tense situation into something more positive. The young man was starting to see that his simple, impulsive action had become a moment that would be remembered, not for what went wrong, but for what went right. The officer's approach had taught him, and perhaps everyone else watching, a valuable lesson about how to handle the unexpected with grace and patience. The young man realized that in a world where things often felt chaotic or out of control, sometimes a calm reaction was all that was needed to turn everything around. As he walked through the crowd, reflecting on the day's events, the young man began to feel a sense of pride. Not only had he learned something important, but he had also been part of something that had brought people together. What started as a simple, innocent mistake had blossomed into a lesson in kindness, and it was something that would stay with him for a long time. As the day went on, the young man began to feel a sense of calm settle over him. What had started as an anxious and awkward moment had transformed into something more positive than he could have imagined. The crowd had dispersed slowly, but a few lingering people still chatted about the event. The young man overheard some conversations about the officer's calm response and how impressed everyone was by how it had been handled. He couldn't help but smile. He realized that what he had thought would be a small mistake had turned into a bigger learning moment, not just for him, but for others as well. The officer's ability to stay composed and even make light of the situation had taught the young man a valuable lesson. In life, it wasn't always about avoiding mistakes, but about how you handled them when they happened. Instead of trying to hide or run away from the moment, the officer had embraced it with grace, and the young man now understood that sometimes it was okay to make mistakes as long as you learned from them. As he made his way out of the square, he found himself reflecting on how different people responded to unexpected situations. The officer's professionalism had stood out, but the crowd's reaction was equally interesting. It wasn't that they saw the young man's action as something bad. It was more like they recognized that people were all just trying to navigate the world in their own way. Even the smallest things could catch someone's attention or spark a moment of curiosity, and that was okay. The young man also began to realize something else. While he had been embarrassed and nervous earlier, most people had simply moved on. No one was judging him, and no one was talking about his actions in a negative way. The idea that everyone was watching and making judgments had seemed so real in the moment, but in reality, the event was just one small part of a busy, active day. It wasn't the world's biggest mistake, and no one was focused on him for too long. Everyone was simply going about their day, just like he would. The young man started to feel more at ease with this realization. The pressure he had placed on himself was all in his head. As he walked through the streets, the sound of life around him seemed to return to normal. People were moving on with their day, and the event in the square was slowly becoming a memory. The young man felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. He understood now that life wasn't about holding on to moments of discomfort or embarrassment. It was about learning from them and allowing them to pass by. What surprised him the most was how easily he had learned this lesson. It had only taken a small action, a moment of impulsiveness, and the calm, patient response of one officer to shift his perspective. He felt grateful for that officer's kindness, and he began to think that maybe, just maybe, he could bring a little bit of that calmness into his own life. Instead of reacting hastily to moments that made him uncomfortable, he could learn to take a step back, breathe, and handle things with more understanding. Later that evening, as the young man sat down to reflect on the day, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. He knew he would remember this experience for a long time. It had been a small, seemingly insignificant event, but it had taught him a lot about patience, understanding, and the power of a calm response in times of tension. And as he thought about it, he couldn't help but smile. Maybe, just maybe, the small, unexpected moments in life were the ones that held the most important lessons. As days passed, the young man couldn't shake the memory of what had happened in the square. It wasn't just the unusual moment with the guard or the officer's calm response that stayed with him. It was the lesson he had learned about handling unexpected situations. He found himself thinking about it more often than he expected, especially when he faced small challenges in his everyday life. He realized how easy it was to let a minor mistake or an awkward moment spiral into something bigger than it needed to be. In the past, when something unexpected happened, he might have gotten flustered, maybe even embarrassed. But after seeing how the officer had stayed composed and handled the situation with such ease, the young man had started to approach things differently. Now, when little things went wrong or moments felt uncomfortable, he reminded himself of that moment in the square. There was no need to rush to judgment, no need to panic. Just stay calm and assess the situation before reacting. One afternoon, the young man was at work when a minor issue arose. A project wasn't coming together as smoothly as he had hoped, and it seemed like nothing was going the way he planned. Normally, this would have made him anxious and frustrated. He might have been tempted to rush through it, or even give up for the day. But instead, he remembered how the officer had approached him in the square. The officer hadn't reacted hastily. He had simply looked at the situation, taken a breath, and decided to handle it with patience and a sense of humor. That thought gave the young man the clarity he needed. Instead of getting upset, he took a step back from the project. He made a cup of tea, cleared his mind, and returned to the work with a fresh perspective. He was amazed at how much calmer he felt. The small problem that had seemed so huge earlier suddenly didn't feel as important. He was able to find a solution more easily, and everything began to fall into place. That afternoon, he realized just how much a shift in mindset could change everything. His new approach didn't stop there. The young man started applying this idea to other aspects of his life. Whether it was a conversation with a friend or something as simple as getting stuck in traffic, he found himself staying more relaxed, more patient. When things didn't go as planned, he no longer felt the urge to react immediately with frustration or stress. Instead, he paused, took a breath, and allowed himself the space to think things through. What surprised him the most was how often people responded positively to this shift in behavior. In conversations, he noticed that when he didn't rush to judgment or react harshly, others were more open and willing to communicate. In work meetings, his newfound patience made it easier to collaborate and find common ground with others. It seemed like the world around him was a little calmer, just because he had decided to handle things differently. The young man realized that he didn't need to be perfect or always have the right answers. It was okay to make mistakes or feel a little awkward in certain situations. What mattered most was how he chose to respond. Just like in the square, when the officer had taken control of the moment with kindness and patience, he had the power to decide how to respond to life's little challenges. In a way, that simple interaction had changed the way he viewed the world. It wasn't just about avoiding uncomfortable situations. It was about how to make the best of them when they happened. He had learned to embrace the unpredictability of life, knowing that there was always an opportunity to grow, learn, and make things better. And with that realization, he felt a sense of peace. The anxiety that used to cloud his thoughts began to fade, replaced by a more balanced, thoughtful approach to life's surprises. As time passed, the young man began to realize that the day in the square had left an impression on him that went far beyond that one incident. It wasn't just about the playful tug on the guard strap or the officer's calm response. What had really stuck with him was the shift in his own perspective, the way he started to see the world and the challenges around him with a new sense of calm and patience. He noticed that this shift wasn't just a small change in how he reacted to things. It had become a part of who he was. When things didn't go according to plan, he no longer felt overwhelmed by frustration. Instead of rushing to solve problems, he took the time to assess the situation and figure out the best way forward. The more he practiced this new approach, the easier it became. It wasn't always perfect, of course. There were still moments of stress, moments when his old habits of reacting quickly crept up on him. But even in those moments, he found that he was able to catch himself more often and reset his thoughts. It wasn't just about him either. The people around him began to notice the change. Friends and colleagues started commenting on how much calmer and more grounded he seemed. One friend even joked that he was becoming the voice of reason in their group. While it made him laugh, the compliment meant more to him than he expected. It was a reminder that the way we respond to the world has an effect on others. His new way of handling things wasn't just helping him, it was creating a ripple effect in the people around him. As the young man reflected on everything he had learned, he thought back to the officer's words in the square. The officer had said that sometimes people just needed to satisfy their curiosity in strange ways. It made him realize that we all have moments where we feel uncertain or unsure, moments when we act on impulse because we don't fully understand something. And that's okay. We don't have to have all the answers, and we don't have to always be in control. Sometimes we just need to take a step back, understand where the other person is coming from, and respond with kindness. It was a simple lesson, but it had made a profound difference in his life. He felt more connected to the world around him. Instead of feeling frustrated or impatient when things didn't go as expected, he began to embrace life's surprises. Each day was a new opportunity to practice patience, to learn from the unexpected, and to approach challenges with a calm mindset. One evening, as he walked through the city streets, he remembered that day in the square with a smile. It wasn't the kind of day he had expected. In fact, he hadn't even realized how much he would take from it at the time. But looking back, he felt grateful for that officer's understanding. He had learned that life wasn't about avoiding mistakes or uncomfortable moments. It was about handling them with grace, learning from them, and moving forward with a clearer mind. The young man had come a long way since that day, and though the memory of the event would always stay with him, he had come to understand that it wasn't the only thing that mattered. It was what he did with that moment, and the lessons he had learned from it that would define who he was. And he was determined to keep growing, to stay calm, and to live each day with a little more patience and understanding than the last.